very glad to be a part of this release function. Particularly glad because I'm not a political scientist, and so I'm really a bit of an interloper here, and I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to express my appreciation for the book. This, of course, is a remarkably timely, insightful, as well as scholarly book. A lot of effort has gone into it, and I enjoyed reading the book. The question which the book raises, and which actually interests me deeply, is have we now in India seen a durable shift to a different kind of politics from what we were used to all these years? Now on this, initial reactions some time ago would perhaps have been yes. But on the other hand, as an economist, I do have some things to say on this, which I'd like to, in particular because I sense that a certain change is beginning to take place. And this change consists in the fact that just as there is an upsurge of the right, increasingly of late we are finding a peasant upsurge taking place in India, the like of which we haven't seen for some time. Persons of my age would remember that in the very old days, mind you, this change in the political discourse has been going on for some time, though of course now it has really reached a head, but people of my age would remember 60s, 70s, the political discourse centered around issues of material life and therefore issues of class resistance as well. Politics was defined, for instance, by, let's say, Mrinal Gore and Ahilya Ramnekar's march in Bombay against price rise, by the railway strike, bank nationalization. These were issues which were concerned essentially, and the enormous peasant gatherings that Mahendra Singh Tikayat used to organize at the Boat Club. These were events that framed the politics of that time, that defined the political discourse, and that were really around issues of material life, and in particular issues of class resistance. Now this tended to go into the background, this has tended to go into the background for a very long time, yes, particularly since we have had the introduction of neoliberal economic policies. No matter what their material impact, they certainly have given rise to an alternative kind of politics which is much more concerned with identity politics, which is much more concerned with issues like corruption and so on. Now, of course, you can say that every issue is a class issue, that all politics is, in one sense or the other, class politics. But on the other hand, I'd like to suggest that we should draw a distinction here between class politics that may be implicit and class politics that's explicit. And therefore, explicit issues of class resistance have not been raised for some time. And of course, of late, this non-class politics has been dominated by Hindutva politics. Now, at the same time, however, for the first time now, we are witnessing a whiff of a fairly strong and sustained peasant resistance, and this is happening all over the country, particularly in a country in which roughly half the workforce is engaged in agriculture. The significance of this peasant resistance must not ever be underestimated. Why it came so late, why it has arisen so late is really an interesting question, because neoliberalism has two very distinct characteristics, of which we normally emphasize one. The first characteristic, which we emphasize always, is the fact that there's a tendency now for capital, which is now much more globalized, international, both in its productive form as well as in the form of finance, is more willing to move to third world countries, more willing to shift activities to third world countries, manufacturing to China, services to India and so on, because of which there is a kind of diffusion of development which is taking place. And this is something that everybody talks about. Our 8% growth rate and so on is really reflective of this diffusion of development that is taking place. But at the same time, neoliberalism has another feature which is less talked about, and that is that it actually unleashes a very serious process of what Marx had called primitive accumulation of capital, at the expense of petty production, at the expense of peasant agriculture. Now, of course, in the earlier days, in what you may call the Nehruvian era, which is much more than simply Nehru's own era, but that really spans the entire period right up to the 1980s, you also had a kind of primitive accumulation in the sense of dispossession of tenants and so on taking place within agriculture. But that was primitive accumulation where, let's say, the landlords were throwing out tenants. There was a reduction in the status of tenants. Tenants became sharecroppers and so on. Tenants became tenants at will. So there was a process of whittling down the rights of certain producers, but that was really internal to the sector. What has happened now is really a squeeze on agriculture. By now, I mean in the neoliberal period, is a squeeze on agriculture which is being imposed by the outside, the non-agriculture, the big business sector. And that arises through curtailment of subsidies, that arises through the impact of the global market in causing enormous price fluctuations for cash crops, that arises from the fact that peasants are not getting remunerative prices. As a matter of fact, between the 1991 and 2011 censuses, 15 million cultivators have in fact given up being cultivators. Some of them may have become laborers, some have migrated to cities, which is really symptomatic of the agrarian crisis, of which the suicides that we hear of are really an obvious symptom. Now, the point is, how come there was no resistance earlier? And that's an interesting issue, and I think the book has many things to say about that. And what is more, one can say that this kind of squeeze on peasant agriculture, which actually takes the form not only of a squeeze on income flows, but also what I would say in the stock form, in terms of dispossession of the peasants of their assets, taking over of land for industrial or infrastructure projects at throwaway prices. This kind of primitive accumulation in both stock and flow forms is something which has particularly come to a head now. I made a calculation some time ago that suppose you take just the period of 2014 onwards, which is the dividing line as far as the book is concerned, you compare 2013-14 with 2016-17 for which we have data, or even 2017-18 for which we can generate data through extrapolation and so on. You look at the total money value of the GDP originating in the agricultural sector, just in current price nominal terms. Look at the per capita nominal income of the agriculture dependent population, deflated by a consumer price index for rural areas, which is available. Very simple exercise, anybody can do it by looking at a copy of the economic survey, and you find that in real terms, the per capita real income of an average person engaged in the agricultural sector in 2016-17 was marginally lower in absolute terms compared to the per capita income in 2013-14. And I'm not comparing non-comparable years. I'm not comparing a bumper harvest with a drought year and so on. None of that. They're both comparable years. So the point is that obviously the squeeze on peasant agriculture, which is a part of neoliberalism, has now reached a head, and it is this which finally I find is now beginning to manifest itself in terms of peasant uprisings, at least in the form of demonstrations as of now. Now this has two very important implications. The first implication, of course, is that the discourse is changing. The discourse, for the first time to my knowledge, is once again issues with which we had been familiar in the 70s and 80s. The discourse is about prices, remunerative prices, peasants' debt, and things of that kind. And the fact that the government itself has been forced into such a discourse by talking about doubling agricultural income by 2023 and so on, which is not going to happen. But the important point is that they are forced to shift their discourse into issues of material living conditions for half the working population of the country. Now, so there's a discourse shift that is taking place whose significance must not be underestimated. The second thing which is happening, which I think again has a lot of importance, is the following. That if you have a squeeze on peasant agriculture, a lot of peasants then, as I mentioned earlier, migrate to cities and so on. At the same time, job creation in the cities has virtually stopped completely. As a result, they swell the reserve army of labor, because of which you actually find that even the working class, including even the organized working class, feels the pinch in terms of its ability to enforce real wage claims. If you compare late 1980s with today, you'd find that the average real wage, even of organized workers, is no higher compared to what it was in the late 80s. So the fortunes of the working class get linked with the fortune of the peasantry in a way that, to my knowledge, has not happened earlier. It's not surprising, therefore, that you actually had a rally the other day in Delhi on the 5th of October, in which you actually had workers and peasants jointly, joining the rally. This is something which is the first time since independence in India. So I think there is not only a revival of a discourse which again talks of material issues, class issues and so on, not only is an upsurge of peasant assertion, the like of which we have not seen since the Mahendra Singh Tikait days, that is actually pre-emergency, but what is more, we have not also seen this coming together of workers, peasants, agricultural laborers, ever since independence. So I would suggest that the issue which is foregrounded in the book is an issue which actually, on which the author has an open mind, is an issue on which we actually now can develop a perspective which is in keeping with the unfolding changes in the Indian political economy, which I think are of very great significance. No doubt all of us are looking at the 2019 elections, what's going to happen in it and so on and so forth, but I think even beyond these elections, there is something emerging which I think is of great significance as far as the Indian political economy is concerned. So I would say that, are we seeing a durable shift in politics and political discourse? I would say that while my answer to that question would have been some months ago, perhaps, now I would say, perhaps not. Thank you very much.